Good morning and welcome. Thank you for being here today. I'm Diane Boyd, the Director of the Video Center for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning and the Chair of this search for the Assistant Vice President of Education and Organizational Learning in the Office of Inclusion and Diversity. I'd like to welcome Dr. Pablo Mendoza. He's the Chief Diversity Officer at Indiana University of Pennsylvania, where he served in that role since 2013. This morning, he'll share with us his definition of inclusive excellence and then move into a workshop on the role of department chairs in transforming departmental culture. Join me in welcoming Dr. Mendoza.
Magandang umaga sa inyo, which is Tagalog for good morning to all of you. You know who I am, where I'm from, so let's go into the presentation so you have an understanding of me. Okay, I was told by Ms. Fuller to address a philosophy or perspective regarding diversity and inclusion and education and organizational learning, program curriculum, learning, experience design, and collaborative approaches with key campus partners. I'm going to try to do that in 4 slides. Okay, let's see what happens. Okay, my definition of diversity and inclusion. Diversity, so you know my background in diversity. I was introduced into diversity trainings in 1977 when I was the representative of my high school to the San Diego Unified School District under the court-ordered busing program that was ordered by one of the courts in Los Angeles. And I went through my first diversity training in 1977. Since that time, as I progressed in my field, I've just come to a very simple diversity definition, which is the demographics of an institution and its community, both on campus and within the context of the state in which it's resident. Now, inclusion is different from diversity. Many people have used the term, inclusion means bringing people to the table, but if you never give someone at the table the opportunity to voice their concerns and participate in the decision-making processes, you are not doing inclusion. You're just doing very, very simple representation, and it's a very different thing. So the key thing about this is you want to address the needs of marginalized populations, which in this room could be any of the women, any of the LGBT, any of the Muslim, Jewish, so on and so forth. Those who do not fit into your regular, standardized, mainstream media definition of what a marginalized population is. The development of cross-cultural competencies. One of the things that, and we'll use an example from the meeting I just came from. You all are familiar with the Johari window, where there's one window where you don't know what you don't know. And we operate that we assume we know things all the time. And it's that assumption that really catches us when we're working with other people. So developing a cross-cultural competency is essential for individuals to actually bridge gaps between populations. And then with majority populations, one of the things that I've had the opportunity to do in both the settings of University of Missouri, and you all know University of Missouri, because there were protests on the campus in 2015. And some of my former diversity peer educators at University of Missouri actually started the protests. So Danielle Walker is now doing her PhD at University of Denver, and she's doing it on the impact of Angela Davis and protest movements in psychology. Brilliant young woman. And I'm really glad that I was, for a time period, her mentor. But one of the things we noticed with University of Missouri and IUP, Indiana University of Pennsylvania, is sometimes our majority populations do not understand what privilege is. And because the literature uses the term privilege, people make the assumption of privilege in the sense of Donald Trump, not in the sense of Peggy McIntosh's unearned privilege dynamics. Okay, the technologies for organizational learning, the technologies must be population specific. So students, faculty, and staff. And that means you want to aim for ways of accessing different populations in your inclusion discussions that make them understand the milieu in which they're operating. So for instance, I've been doing a lot of work with faculty recently, and one of the key things I've noticed in our College of Natural Sciences and Mathematics is the discussion when we talk about becoming more cross-culturally competent. Some people respond, I don't have to be cross-culturally competent, I'm teaching math. Or, I don't have to be cross-culturally competent, I'm teaching chemistry. And then in that same room, having faculty from chemistry and math saying, I'm from Peru, I'm from Ecuador, I am from South Asia, Kashmir region and all that, and you don't understand how math has developed from our places. You're assuming that just because you work with numbers that you're objective, and that ignores the relationship between the histories of, say, algebra and the Muslim world, al-Jabr, so on and so forth, and the development of their fields. Based upon professional observations in 5 university settings, I've come to these generalizations. Now, these generalizations, I want to warn you, are my own personal generalizations, but they're also generalizations that can be corrected given the environment in which we are. And since this is in Ms. Fuller's computer, if you want, she can send you my PowerPoints. So you don't have to waste your space on your iPhone. Students respond best to student peer education. What I mean by that is, I was advisor to the Big 12 Conference on Black Student Government when we hosted the conference in 2002. And I was one of 2 advisors, the director of the Black Culture Center and myself, the Multicultural Center director. And we were having a discussion about potential speakers. And it was a real funny thing, because my colleague in the Black Culture Center said, we can bring this person, we can bring that person, so on and so forth. All these people that excite him as a scholar. And we then asked the students, who do you want to come and be keynote speaker for the Big 12 Conference on Black Student Government? And they said, well, we don't want anyone over the age of 25 because they're too old. We won't understand how they talk. But we want people our age who are active in advocacy in the Big 12 region or in Chicago, because they can relate to our experience. So that's where the students respond best to peer education. Faculty respond to trainings given by academic peers or training organized by academic organizations. This goes back to my experience as a voluntary campus mediator in the campus mediation service at University of Missouri. We tried to, when we did bargaining unit and inter-staff or inter-faculty mediations, we always tried to bring a faculty person to work with a faculty mediation. We always tried to bring in a unionized staff member to do the unionized mediation. The reason why is there seemed to be some disconnect with working with lawyers. I wonder why. Okay, that was a joke that fell flat on its face. My apologies. But when the faculty came in and we did mediations, they didn't respond well when it was me as a student affairs professional without the PhD yet, nor when I was working with Art Hinshaw, who's director from the law school. But when we finally had trained volunteer mediators from the faculty lines, mediations improved drastically. Now, I'm discovering at IUP, faculty, and this is where differentiation between the good side and the evil side of universities come in. Now let me explain what I mean by good and evil. In the eyes of faculty, they're all the good. And you probably heard about the state system for higher education protests and strikes back in October and November. They were the good guys. I'm now on the evil side. As one of the president's cabinet and chief diversity officer, I'm an administrator, so they said, you've made the pact with the devil. So in this sense, when I work with faculty, I always try to work with a faculty partner to do presentations. So when we did the campus climate work, worked very closely with sociology department. When we did the development of college diversity action plan, worked very closely with the faculty from the College of Ed and Ed Technology. And then finally, administration and staff respond to their organizational or their bargaining unit peers. What that means is, when we were doing campus mediation at Missouri, they responded well to me as a staff member, but they responded better to the volunteer mediator who was the Carpenters Union vice president, so on and so forth. So you want to have technologies that recognize the differentiation between the different populations. Oops. Additional learning steps, and you have done part of this already. So identify deficiencies in your diversity and inclusion knowledge, and training must be established through validated assessment. Now, you have just completed a campus climate instrument, and you have now dispersed the knowledge of it, and now you're trying to develop campus plans or college plans, and hopefully long-term a campus climate action plan. So those are the two things that you've already started to do here at Auburn that I read about through your website. Now, one of the things that I've discovered and I've seen in the literature is developing pilot projects that test concepts. Now, one of the things that I observed at Missouri substantially was when people brought in outside groups. Actually, let me give you one for the whole state system for Pennsylvania. Has everybody heard of the equity scorecard out of University of Southern California?
Estella Bensimon?
Yes, Estella Bensimon. She actually was working with all of us, the social equity officers, to do that in our system. So I actually went to trainings with her in Harrisburg 2 times. And one of the things that was interesting was the system chancellor said, you will do this, without giving faculty a chance to give input on how it would fit in with the specific campus cultures. And since we only have one campus in the whole state system, which is primarily urban in orientation, there was some difficulty in, say, translating some of the equity scorecard statements into a place like Clarion, where they have only 3,000 students. And over time, all the presidents decoupled from that process. So only 2 campuses still do the equity scorecard, and that's because they didn't test the validity for the culture that's involved. Now, develop a training core or online mechanisms to provide the content for peer education in groups. And that means, for instance, what I'm doing right now is with the College of Health and Human Services, we are looking at 10 different models for cross-cultural competency in the curriculum. And we are going to then send a core of faculty to go through that training and then bring it back to IUP to actually work it out and see how well it works within the College of Health and Human Services before it goes out to the whole campus. So, and then evaluate the learning on an annual basis. And then with regard to working with campus partners, leadership roles, so working with your deans, bargaining units, stewards, Student Government Association, identify community organizations like the NAACP, League of United Latin American Communities, news agencies, and then the power of diverse alumni to transform a campus. So, and that's the first presentation. I hope I didn't use all my time. Now let me do the longer presentation, which is 10 slides. Any questions while I set up the other one? Escape. No questions? Do you mind if I just dive in?
Go right ahead.
Okay. Okay, this one was the second question. Conduct a workshop session for faculty and staff regarding a contemporary diversity, inclusion, or inclusive excellence science-related topic. So I'm going to look at department chairs. Now, there is some recent research by Edna Chun and Alvin Evans out of North Carolina State. They recently published a book of their research findings and then developed an instrument and then have a really good set of arguments for the rest of the text on why department chairs should be used. Now, the reason I chose department chairs is, number one, through the context of the post-University of Missouri and Yale University student protests, our students are calling for departments to have better departmental responses to student needs. Personal perspective on the protests, I already mentioned that some of the students I worked with at Missouri were part of the leaders of the protests. And then third, student activism has arisen because of protesters' desires for the institutions that they deeply love. And this is the key thing. Students don't protest unless they deeply love a place. To live up to the aspirations expressed by administration and the missions. So that's a real tough thing because right now we're in a world where some boards of curators and board of trustees aren't looking at the protests as a means for diversity empowerment. They're now looking at a response for diversity management, which is a different aspect. And I've had that question presented to me by one board member at one time. Okay. The relationship between the university and an individual student is best explained by student-faculty interaction. Faculty treats students largely based upon the leadership exhibited by department chairs. Now let me explain what I mean by that bullet. If a department chair just gives emphasis to getting your publications out there and very little to service, then that is entering the psychology of a faculty member stating, I will get points for doing all these first, second publications within a time period. I will not really get service for my interaction with LGBT students and their support, or how I incorporate multiculturalism into the curriculum, so on and so forth. Student protests usually highlight poor treatment experienced in both the classroom and their co-curricular activities. So if you're familiar with Sue Rankin out of Penn State, she validated an instrument in the early 2000s, and it's an instrument that's been used by about 250 universities now for their campus climate. The key finding there was when you provide poor support networks for LGBT students and LGBT faculty and staff, you will have poor responses from the populations, and they'll feel disenfranchised. Now, Sylvia Hurtado, who's out of the Higher Education Research Institute at UCLA, has developed a new instrument for assessment called the Diverse Learning Environments Assessment, which is aimed primarily at student experience, not so much faculty staff. And it's about dealing with student persistence. And one of the highlights from when she published her paper in 2011, 2012, was many of the students felt that they were lacking the mentors that could take place, whether they be of their ethnicity or gender, in the department. And that is one area where mentors needed to take place and be present. And then finally, and for many of you who are faculty, and some of you who are staff, sometimes you assume the faculty, the department chair role without much training. You get elected to it by your peers, and then in some cases, if you end up calling HR and have a mediation like I've been involved with, those peers will say, you weren't perfect as a department chair, but the department chair response was, I never received training. So we need to make sure that department chairs get the training. Now, I want to talk about department chairs and recognize something about department chairs that I hope you will understand from my perspective. And just so you know, I just did a dry run-through with the woman I'm dating, and she's the department chair of the philosophy department. And she said, you ignored the burden that department chairs already have. And I said, oh, sorry, dear. So this line is from her, who's the department chair of philosophy. The instructional load, the management load, the fiscal load, and then the publication load of department chairs are many times ignored by upper administrators and by students. And there's some burden there that if this takes place, you need to make sure that you recognize that before you dump a new process onto them. Now, recent research on the subject provides some insight. Brooks' work on higher education leadership development basically talks about how universities, he's out of Monash in Australia, do not do anything to any great extent on developing cross-cultural competency in Australian and American universities based upon his data collection and meta-analysis from 2011 and 2013. And he's now writing a text on how you can incorporate cross-cultural competencies from boards of directors all the way down to frontline faculty. And then I mentioned already Chun and Evans' instrument on department chair self-assessment. Now, training models that can help develop this content knowledge. Department chairs and classroom technologies. I believe strongly in identifying core individuals to go to trainings where they can then take the training and then train their peers through the context of Centers for Teaching Excellence, so on and so forth. So, Ford Foundation for a number of years sponsored the Difficult Dialogues program, and faculty fellows are at most of the Big 12 and Big 10 institutions who then lead the discussions. And really good developmental model. University of Michigan developed intergroup relations after the Gratz v. Bollinger and Grutter v. Bollinger lawsuits that went up to the Supreme Court. And it is a sociology-based curriculum that will help faculty to understand how you incorporate diversity discussions in your presentation of classroom knowledge. And then critical race and feminism theories to supplement classroom instruction. Now, that is probably a very weighted statement because not all are versed in critical race theory or feminism theory, and in some environments that would be considered objectionable. Now, the reason I include it is I am a tribal critical race theorist. My work is on American Indians and STEM. And one of the things I've noticed in my STEM colleagues, math teachers and science teachers and all that, is they don't understand how other parts of the world influence the development of science knowledge. I already talked about algebra and al-Jabr out of the Muslim world, but we don't talk about the development of some of the linear equation models out of China, or we don't talk about how the Peruvian world incorporated mathematics in a different way than the Greeks did. So there's that aspect. And then we also have the aspect of, we all know that anonymous means that was developed by a woman. So historically, the anonymous person didn't receive credit because they were female. And that is a highly problematic thing with regard to our training models. Okay, student demands for a diverse faculty representation. In each protest nationally, students noted that faculty representation was not on par with student percentages or those of their state populations. That was a big key thing in the Yale, in the Brandeis, in the Tufts, in the University of Missouri, the protests out of UCLA, so on and so forth. And now we're in this really strange place, and where when I presented at the American Association for the Advancement of Science on STEM pipeline initiatives to develop American Indian PhDs, we are seeing that the deficiency isn't so much pipeline or acculturation issues or what universities provide. But this was a statement by one of my colleagues when I presented at the AAAS meeting. So if you want to incentivize hiring of diverse candidates, you're going to have to incentivize it to a better place than, say, Google or Apple or NASA. Because those people that can go into industry will make much more money than what they will do in higher ed. So this is where you get into partnerships with industry, where you hopefully, like Carnegie Mellon has done successfully, developed a core of technology professionals who are diverse, who have instructional lines, but also work with major corporations like Garmin. And then department chairs may or may not have received sufficient recruitment and retention of diverse faculty training. What that means is developing support networks for the diverse faculty so they don't feel this profound isolation at the institution that they're going to. Now, let me give you a case in point. I was talking with one of my colleagues from California, University of Pennsylvania. Yeah, we have wonderful names in Pennsylvania. She was nursing faculty. African-American woman in her mid-20s. And she was hired for a tenure track line and was going to stay at Cal U until she received tenure. And then I said, so you're going to stay after you receive tenure? And she said, no. I just want to get tenure so I can then transfer it to another institution. And I said, why? And she said, I moved to Cal U because I knew that I would be able to get tenure. But I also realized that being one of 3 African Americans on campus, in faculty lines, and someday I want to have children, means I don't have that connection for critical mass representation. So when we ask chairs to look at their representation, we need to look at the environmental factors that help people stay. Now, I'm not familiar too well with Auburn's situation, but because you're a Tier 1 doctoral institution, you will have stronger critical mass representation than, say, an IUP or a Cal U, which are Tier 2 and Tier 3 campuses. Now, diverse faculty recruitment, there are different models out there. The Oregon State University Diversity Search Advocate Program is training department chairs on how to recognize bias in their search processes and when individuals are using discriminatory language in their assessment of peers. University of Wisconsin's Women in Science, Engineering, Leadership Institute is an effort to train STEM faculty and STEM department chairs to recognize when you're being sexist in search processes and support processes, and in the language in which you work with women, all women, in your department. We ran into some of that in mediations in the chemistry department at IUP recently. Southern Regional Education Board Faculty Institute. I believe Auburn's already a member of it, because I believe I've seen an Auburn table when I've gone to Southern Regional Education Board recruitment. It's a really neat thing because it's sponsored by NASA. It's aimed primarily at STEM research, and most institutions in the South get automatic membership. There's still a fee, but it's not the fee that you get if you're a Pennsylvania institution going to the Southern Regional Education Board. And then postdoctoral fellowships. You have this in some places. So for instance, in the State System for Higher Ed in Pennsylvania, we have the Frederick Douglass Institute, where there are 5 diverse scholars every year for each of the 14 campuses that are set there so they can do postdoc work, and then after the end of the year, they can either move on or go for a second year. And if they go for the second year, they're often offered a tenure track live on the campus that they've been on. And then incentivize hiring. And as a state institution, this is going to be difficult because incentivized hiring sometimes means money. And it's a delicate subject, but when we're competing with Harvard, Brown, and Stanford, where each of them have said they're going to do $100 million over the next 10 years to recruit diverse faculty, that makes it somewhat difficult for those of us who work at state institutions, like University of Missouri, University of Illinois, Auburn University. Okay, diverse faculty retention, mentorship. At Missouri, I was part of the Pan-Asian Faculty Staff Association and the Hispanic Latin American Faculty Staff Association. And what we did there was partner senior faculty with new junior faculty so they could understand what research strands, service, and teaching responsibilities like. So that was mentoring there, and that exists on many campuses. I believe that that's something that is already here at Auburn. Am I correct or not? Okay, I guess I'll find out. Research support, that means finding research funds to help people go to presentations and actually conduct the research. And that's usually tied with NSF or College of Ed or Department of Ed funding and all that. And then finally, conference support, sending your diverse faculty to places where they can make the connections with peers, like at NCORE or at the AAAS or National Association of Black Journalists or so on and so forth, other places where they can be the critical mass representation. And then challenges facing department chairs. Institutional culture. I think everybody's heard this in one way or the other, so let me use University of Illinois. That's not the Illini way. University of Missouri, we've done it like this for the last 120 years. It's worked for us. Or as one person said to me at IUP, we have diversity at IUP. We have Germans, Italians, and Polish people. We've been pretty diverse now for the last 50 years. And I'm trying to get people to think, you know, how about our students from Philadelphia or Pittsburgh or the new Amish program that I'm working with to get Amish people into college. So you have to deal with institutional cultures and institutional prejudices. Budgetary constraints. I mentioned the Stanford, Harvard, and Brown University budgetary constraints. There are other budgetary constraints that you may face. So for instance, depending on the state you're in, I will give the example of University of Missouri. I supervised the LGBT Resource Center for a number of years while I was there. And there was always activity by the state legislature to eliminate funding for LGBT support services. So every Labor Day for a period of 3 years in the mid-2000s, we would get a request to provide a report to the state legislature on the day before Labor Day weekend. We would receive the request at 4 o'clock, and then we would be required to provide that report at 9 a.m. on the following Tuesday after Labor Day. So I didn't have Labor Day for a number of years, but the whole idea from that state legislature was to eliminate funding for LGBT support services throughout the state, and his staff made that same request to each of the 17 higher ed institutions in the state of Missouri. Considerations. How do I say this delicately, but also being politic? Using the example of the LGBT request again, the political motivation in that request out of that southwestern Missouri legislator was an example of political considerations that he was responding to that demanded that we responded to, that was tied specifically to budgets. So those are some of the challenges facing department chairs. Other challenges have to do with their instructional load and trying to balance the administrative responsibilities as well as trying to maintain their 2-2 line as it is at IUP. I do not know what department chairs are required to be here. But 2-2 is a lot for an administrative person to handle. So at that, questions for either presentation, and did I do it in the correct amount of time, Ms. Fuller? Okay. What?
Yes, that's when you start.
Okay, good. I want to make sure I live up to your expectations. Any questions for me? Yes, ma'am.
I'm actually really interested, you had mentioned the climate assessment that you were involved in. I would like to kind of know more about that and kind of what you did and your role in that.
Okay, there were 2 places that we did it. The Rankin Instrument, we were part of the 25, 27 campuses around the nation that helped Sue Rankin at Penn State validate it in the early 2000s. And how I worked with that was recruitment of students from diverse populations who worked closely with the Multicultural Center at Missouri. And then I did some qualitative analysis. The second time I worked with the Rankin Instrument was I was the primary investigator on the IRB proposal for the quant instrument, and I worked closely with faculty in mathematics and psychology, and I set up all the logistics for the quant instrumentation with faculty, staff, and students. So in that role, I worked as a facilitative function. In regard to the cross model for the student of color survey that we did, that was generative between me and the Black Culture Center director. We used Cross's instrument and then sent it out to all underrepresented populations through campus email. And then I did a Chromebox Alpha to test the internal validity of the instrument for the data we collected. Now, I was also involved with the Big 12 conference on Big 12 conference for American Indian student leadership. And I helped with construction of the instrument with Cornell Piwawardi, who's now chair of Indigenous Studies at Portland State University and former president of Comanche Nations College. And we took a modification of whose survey? I think it was a modification of Maheshawa's survey. Maheshawa is a tribal critical race theorist. His own insights on ethnic fraud issues in higher education with regard to American Indian ethnic fraud. And I helped with the data collection there and doing some rudimentary t-test analysis. But it was primarily the qualitative work of the recorded focus groups we did at the conference that really proved to be the most useful out of that instrumentation. So does that answer your question about campus climate surveys?
Yeah, I think so. I would also kind of be interested to know anything that you sort of found out that you were like, oh, I was not expecting that.
Yes. The Missouri instrumentation, and it ended up being a very profound data point that helped me with getting faculty to understand the role that they play with making the campus more cross-culturally competent. 90% of our students who were diverse background came from environments in which they made up 85% of the population, and their interaction with majority individuals were primarily school teachers who came in to their school districts, taught, and then left. They were not members of their school district. And then 85% of the majority students from the St. Louis, Kansas City, Chicago, Dallas suburbs had only 85% of the students had lived in environments in which they made up 95%. Dallas, Chicago, St. Louis, and Kansas City. And their interaction with diverse students was primarily through sports in their high school. So you have these two large cohorts who had no interaction whatsoever, getting their first interaction at University of Missouri. And you wondered why there was conflict in the residence halls, or there was conflict with some of the faculty between the diverse students and the majority faculty, or the diverse faculty with the majority students. So that was one of the big data points out of the 2001-2003 administration of the Rankin study. So that was a real big aha moment. So, answer your question?
Yeah.
Other questions?
Dr. Mendoza, there's a growing field of literature in diversity and inclusion science.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about why there's it's growing across sectors? Talk more about higher education and talk about the top of mind key diversity and inclusion science issues in higher ed.
I think, and this is more personal perspective, I guess, but the key issue that has been recurrent to me is how do we do diversity and inclusion in a political climate that does not value that? And some research out of Harvard Business Review from April 2015 and 2016 indicates that we have not moved forward on diversity and inclusion discussions with regard representational diversity. For instance, that study indicated that those individuals who actually get points in higher education and corporate settings for talking about diversity and inclusion tend to be white males. And the people who get the most injurious response in corporation and higher education are women and ethnic minorities when they voice it. It's the dynamic of the anger versus the I am progressive. And I think we're evidencing that on many college campuses. Another key thing, and this is based upon sociological literature within ethnic studies, the strong budgetary and political shrinkage of support for ethnic studies at the college level and as a response at the high school and junior high level, secondary and elementary, and the step away from it. I was talking with some colleagues at San Francisco State University, and you may not know San Francisco State University had the only college of ethnic studies in the nation. Not Department of Ethnic Studies, but College of Ethnic Studies. And they're now getting pressure to eliminate it because state funding for ethnic studies is shrinking dramatically. And one of my colleagues there is trying to shore up that. So we're seeing a shrinkage of access to diverse academic resources. And we're seeing a political movement to try to mitigate some of the advances by diverse populations over the last 20, 30 years. So I don't know if that answers your question. So.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am, you had a
Question, it was more of a response. I hate for you to throw a question out and then just get crickets back. So your point about mentoring programs, I think that's an area where there's a lot of opportunity for Auburn University in that it's been done different ways, but it's not necessarily been done centrally in a way that is strategic and meaningful. A lot of it is done, as you know, in the department, which is good. Certainly has its scholarship merits, in promoting faculty and preparing them. But as far as, cultural competency and engagement, I think that is an area where we have a lot of capacity to grow. I didn't want you to not have an answer to the question.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Other questions for me? Yes, ma'am.
I believe it was in your earlier presentation about philosophy that you mentioned that students only protest when they love. They love the institution, and so they would protest. Let me see, I took a note about it. Students don't protest unless they deeply love a place.
Yes.
I'd like you to riff on that a little bit and also have a little climate here. Our students are super polite. They're polite to their detriment, I would say. And I'd like to hear you both riff on why any research supporting this claim that students don't protest unless they love a place, and then any idea for how that would bear out at a place like Auburn.
Okay. The research that I'm familiar with on student protests was from the 1970s and 1980s. So I believe that you're going to start seeing a good deal of research coming out of Yale, Missouri, and Brandeis within the next 3 years, because I know some of the sociology faculty at those campuses who actually did surveys of the students while they were protesting. But the literature from the 1970s talked about how student protest was done primarily because they felt that they were excluded from the curriculum. And they wanted to have institutions that actually responded to their needs in the curriculum. So hence why the development of ethnic studies program, first at San Francisco State and then Cal Berkeley the following year, even though Cal Berkeley tends to claim that they developed ethnic studies. And how that grew around the whole United States with women's studies and all that. There was some literature out of UC Berkeley in the 1980s by Asian American faculty in political science, talking about how Asian American students were starting to protest against University of California because they were perceiving discriminatory admissions policies. And there were 2 books about that in the late 1990s about how those protests in the 80s manifested themselves. So I think we're going to be in a new place of some literature within the next few years based upon the protest movements that took place in November. So, and I know that Jeff Brooks out of Monash actually looked at some protest literature and student activities function, and how student affairs helps with some protest perspectives. So there was also an occasional series in New Directions in Student Affairs that did a special issue on student activism in 2005, but it's pretty dated now, just like all the other sources I gave you are pretty dated. So I'm sorry I can't give you something in the last 5 years.
I ask because in some ways protest is the outcropping of the absence of meaningful or productive feedback loops.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think certainly now we're in an era of broken feedback loops.
Yes.
In higher ed.
Well, actually, I can respond to that in the University of Missouri case to some extent, if that's okay with
Yeah,
you.
that's wonderful.
Okay, when I was Multicultural Center Director at University of Missouri, I worked with the student government, the diverse student government chairs, and scheduled a meeting with the then Chancellor of the campus and the President of the system. The Chancellor meeting took place every semester, and Chancellor Deaton would come. We would have the students present their questions about how the university was developing. And he would then provide the answers. So we always gave him 2 weeks' notice to develop the answers that needed to be addressed by the students. And then the campus president, in which Elson Floyd came and Manuel Pacheco came once a year to talk about movements with regard to faculty and administration and retention around diverse issues. I left in 2013. Chancellor Deaton left in 2014. And the president of the system left in 2014. And they hired a new campus chancellor who was from Texas A&M, Chancellor Lofton, and he did not reestablish the semesterly meetings with the Diverse Student Leadership Council forefront. And then the students who were used to that were going, wait, we used to have an avenue, why don't we have that avenue now? And when the president of the system didn't respond to a request for a meeting, and then they made the decision around student insurance policy and grad student insurance policy, which was the precipitating moment for the protests, not any racial incident. where the decision by administration was to eliminate insurance with only 2 weeks' notice. That resulted in a campus protest that was small, but the beginning of the larger protest that took place in November, that took place in September. So it was a powder keg because the feedback loop that had existed. And it wasn't, I would say, just because of me. It was because the students wanted to maintain that. And it was something that had happened for the previous 20 years. So 10 years before I arrived, disappeared. And that's why you had the student, Jonathan Butler, do a hunger strike. And then you had the football, basketball team protest. So it's a real interesting dynamic of lack of feedback loops. When you shut off communication channels, it's highly problematic. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Can we go back to the second part of Diane's question about the culture of Auburn's community and how students who are, a lot of students who are often very polite and who often love Auburn, who have been coming to football games since they were 5. We have the mantra of the Auburn family. Can you tell me about how you might approach this when working with this particular population of students?
Okay. The manner in which I would approach it would probably be very similar to what I did at Missouri. Missouri, they had a big football culture. You've played against them. And I believe you've totally routed them 2 or 3 times, which is painful to me because they're my favorite Tigers. They're very, very polite. The majority students really didn't do well with the protests of the diverse students at Missouri. And what is interesting there is there's this desire to value order than progress at many institutions. So the perspective of many of the majority students at Missouri was, it's obvious that you do not love this institution, because if you love this institution, you would not be protesting. You would just accept it the way it is, even though I knew students who were called derogatory names around ethnicity, around religion, and around gender at Missouri. And they were the ones who said, I'm a Missouri Tiger as well, and I want you to hear me. And this is work that was done by the director of the Greek Life Office. She started saying you cannot have Pan-Hellenic meetings and IFC meetings without the Divine Nine present and the Multicultural Greek Council present. And when she made that determination and then started doing joint meetings with all the councils, there was some sort of change there that took place over the last 5 years, where some of the Greeks, actually the majority Greeks, supported the minority Greeks. And when they saw the visible pain of the Divine Nine students with the racial incidents in Greektown and Greek Village, which are 2 different places around Missouri, those presidents who had interacted with their peers disciplined those students who were involved with the discriminatory behavior, and then expelled them from their chapters, saying you do not represent us as a Greek population, because we love Missouri, and that means including all students at Missouri, all the Tigers. So does that answer your question?
Absolutely.
Okay.
It very much is reflective of a conversation recently between the SGA president, the VP for Outreach, OID, looking at an opportunity to have these very critical conversations engaging the Greek communities, the NPHC, the less visible multicultural Greek organizations here, but sort of bringing those groups together and doing it in a very student-centric, student-driven way with support from OID, but with the real lead from SGA and some of the other Greek organizations. So opportunities yet to be explored.
And I believe, I used to supervise experiential education. You all know, and that's high and low ropes, right? So I would take my student leaders from the Diverse Student Council, and the SGA president, or MSA, Missouri Student Association president, to a campsite for a 3-day retreat just to build connections. Did that for the last 10 years I was at Missouri. And I did something that many people hated, which was I took away their cell phones and their computers for the 3 days and forced them to live in rooms with other people cross-culturally. And when they have this common enemy of the guy holding their electronics, they bonded in some helps build communication paths. And it was really interesting, the first few years that we did it, watching the SGA president actually go to Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Hajj, is that correct? Adha, Eid, Mubarak, and Eid for Ramadan, and actually participating in Ramadan programs with the Muslim Student Organization, where they had never done that in the previous 10 years of the existence of the Muslim Student Organization. Was really cool because that was a direct outgrowth of that artificial isolation. So, other questions?
Well, thank you.
Thank you for your time today. And if you have any further questions, Ms. Fuller can give you my email, so that way you can track me down and ask me.